A black woman in a wheelchair gets violently arrested on a quiet Charleston street for doing nothing but asking for directions. The cop who slammed her down thought she was helpless, invisible, and easy to silence. What he didn't know, she's a retired Navy SEAL, highly decorated, trained in combat, and this time, she wasn't the one on trial. Stay with us, because this story doesn't end with an apology. It ends with a reckoning that shook an entire system. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. Under the low amber glow of a street lamp in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, a woman in a wheelchair waited silently beside her parked car. The streets were quiet at that hour, the city still asleep, save for the hum of a few late-night cabs and the faint buzz of neon signs in nearby bars. The woman, dressed in a simple navy blue hoodie and black jeans, scrolled through her phone looking for directions back to her hotel. To anyone passing by, she might have appeared unremarkable, a tired traveler wrapping up a long day. But to Officer Greg Thorne, cruising slowly in his patrol car, she was something else entirely. He pulled up beside her, without rolling down the window at first. His eyes narrowed. To him, she fit a profile. Black. Alone. In a part of town that wasn't hers. Add to that the wheelchair, he didn't even consider that she could be a threat or someone important. To him, she was simply out of place. Suspicious. When he stepped out of the vehicle and demanded to know what she was doing there, the woman Camille Brooks looked up with the calm precision of someone trained not to panic. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, met his without flinching. She politely explained that she was looking for directions. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge him. She simply asked, "Officer, have I done something wrong?" That question, measured, respectful, should have de-escalated things. But instead, it ignited something in Thorne. He asked for her ID. Camille asked why. His voice rose. Hers didn't. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, gripping the handles of her wheelchair as if asserting his authority through force. Camille tried to pull away her voice, rising not in aggression, but alarm. Moments later, she was on the ground, face pressed against cold concrete, hands behind her back, accused of resisting arrest and attempting to assault a police officer. It all happened so fast. A woman who had survived war zones now found herself shackled on a sidewalk in her own country by the very people sworn to protect it. What Officer Thorne didn't know, what he never even bothered to ask, was who Camille Brooks really was. The arrest report was written before dawn. The language used was painfully familiar: belligerent, non-compliant, threatened officer safety. No mention of the wheelchair. No mention of her tone or her restraint. Just a narrative, a neatly packaged justification. Camille said almost nothing during her night in holding. She didn't scream. She didn't protest. She just watched, listened, took mental notes. That's what she had been trained to do. Because Camille Brooks wasn't just anyone. She was a retired lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, a SEAL, 20 years of service, 4 deployments, Bronze Star, and the composure of someone who had walked through fire and come out steady. But none of that mattered to Officer Thorne. Not her sacrifice, not her discipline. not her dignity. In his eyes, she was just another black woman to be put in her place. And that right there is where this story begins. Because this isn't just a story about a wrongful arrest. This is a story about assumptions, about how a black woman in a wheelchair was seen as invisible, about how a man in uniform believed he could twist the truth and walk away clean, about how a courtroom, a city, and eventually a nation came to see what happens when someone underestimated refuses to stay silent. The morning Camille walked into court, she was dressed not in military regalia, not in medals or ribbons, but in a simple gray suit. Her hair braided neatly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Journalists had already picked up the story. Disabled woman, accused of assaulting officer. The public narrative leaned sympathetic, but confused. How dangerous could she have really been in the courtroom? Officer Thorne was all confidence. He sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by colleagues, his uniform crisp, and his face set with practiced conviction. He knew the drill. He'd been on the force for 12 years. His testimony would be clear, firm, and believable. People trusted uniforms. What he didn't expect, what no one in that room expected, was what would come next. Camille Brooks was not there to beg for understanding. She was not there to plead. She was there to expose a lie, to reclaim her name, to reveal a truth that would shake the room to its core. Because when she finally spoke, when she unfolded who she really was, the silence that followed was unlike anything that courtroom had ever known. This is not a story of anger. It is a story of restraint, of integrity, of a woman who had been trained not just to survive, but to stand. And when the lie tried to bury her, she did what she had done so many times before she rose. What makes someone invisible in a system built to ignore them? Is it the color of their skin, their body, their silence, or is it simply the refusal of others to see? In the end, Camille Brooks wasn't invisible. She was the storm they didn't see coming. The courtroom air felt heavier the next day, as if the walls themselves anticipated the weight of what was to come. The local news stations had picked up the story overnight. What had once been a quiet proceeding now echoed with the quiet thunder of public curiosity. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, drawn not by spectacle, but by a question echoing across Charleston. Who was telling the truth? Officer Greg Thorne arrived in full uniform, his badge gleaming, his expression unreadable behind the mask of stoic authority. He walked with the kind of confidence worn only by those who believe in their own invincibility. It was the same confidence with which he had pinned Camille Brooks's arms behind her back just days earlier. The badge on his chest, the same one that had once symbolized trust, now felt like a shield wielded by a man protecting not justice, but ego. The prosecution began their case with mechanical certainty. Officer Thorne was called to the stand, his oath taken with practiced ease. He spoke with clarity and command, laying out his version of events. He told the jury that Camille had been aggressive, that she had refused to cooperate, and his voice lowering for effect that she had attempted to reach for his firearm. It was all so methodical, so rehearsed. Every word, every pause, every detail engineered to cast himself as the victim of a dangerous encounter. But something didn't sit right. Not with Camille, not with her attorney, not with the room. Because when Thorne described Camille, he used words that weren't just false, they were lazy. Agitated, hostile, threatening. The same tired vocabulary that had been weaponized against black women for generations. He never mentioned the wheelchair, never admitted the power imbalance, never acknowledged her restraint. He believed that badge would cover the holes in his story, that his uniform would speak louder than any truth Camille could offer. But Camille was watching. From her seat at the defense table, she observed every twitch of his jaw, every flicker in his eyes. Years of military service had taught her how to read people under pressure. And Officer Thorne, for all his training, was beginning to crack. Still, the courtroom leaned toward him. The jurors listened intently, nodding at his words. That was the power of the badge, the presumption of credibility. He had the floor. He had the story. He had the system. But what he didn't have, what he never imagined he needed, was the truth. Camille's attorney, Jordan Maddox, rose for cross-examination. Young, smart, and painfully aware of the stakes, Jordan knew that taking apart Thorne's testimony wouldn't be easy. The system was designed to protect its own. But he also knew Camille. He knew the strength she carried, the discipline she embodied, and the calm certainty in her voice when she had said, "He's lying." Officer Thorne Jordan began his voice, calm but firm. "You testified that Ms. Brooks was loitering in a high-crime area after hours. Can you explain what specifically made her appear suspicious to you?" Thorne shifted in the witness chair. She was alone, in an alley. It was late. Alone in a public space, Jordan repeated, in a wheelchair, not breaking any laws, just existing. Thorne narrowed his eyes. She wouldn't answer my questions. Did she have to? Jordan asked, his tone sharper now. Did she legally owe you anything more than silence? The courtroom was silent. Thorne's mouth opened, then closed. Jordan moved closer. You say she tried to reach for your weapon. Did you recover any fingerprints on your holster? Any body cam footage showing the altercation? Thorne's jaw tightened. My body cam malfunction. Jordan raised an eyebrow. Convenient. That word hung in the air like smoke. Do you have a record of when the camera last functioned correctly? Thorne hesitated. Not on hand. Jordan took a step back and turned to the jury. So let me get this straight. No footage, no fingerprints, no witnesses, just your word against hers. He let that statement settle, then returned to his seat. Camille remained composed. She hadn't flinched once during Thorne's testimony. She knew what came next. Her turn. She rolled to the witness stand with quiet grace. The weight of 100 eyes bore down on her, but she carried it like she had carried so many other burdens without complaint. Her voice when she spoke was calm and steady. She told her truth plainly. She recounted each moment not with anger, but with precision. She described his tone, his body language, the way he grabbed her arm without cause. She didn't embellish. She didn't accuse. She simply laid bare the facts, and then she said the words that shifted the room. When he grabbed me, Camille said softly, I asked him to stop. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I just asked him why. She paused, then looked directly at the jury. I wasn't resisting. I was reminding him that I am human. There was no outrage in her tone, just quiet strength. Jordan returned to the stand with a final question. Ms. Brooks, the officer accused you of being a threat. Do you consider yourself dangerous? Camille's answer came without hesitation. I've been dangerous. I've been trained to dismantle weapons in combat zones. I've led rescue missions behind enemy lines. I know what violence looks like, and I know when it's necessary. But that night, I was just a woman in a wheelchair trying to get home. The silence that followed was unlike the one that had fallen during Thorne's testimony. It was heavier, truer. In that moment, the badge faltered. The lie began to crack, and for the first time in that courtroom, the truth was not only heard, it was felt. The next morning, the air inside the courthouse carried a different weight, not the electric buzz of curiosity, but the heavy quiet of reckoning. Word had spread, not just about the case, but about Camille Brooks. People didn't know the whole story yet, but something had shifted. This wasn't just another trial, it was becoming a mirror. Camille arrived in silence. Her wheelchair rolled steadily along the smooth stone floor, her head held high, shoulders squared. She wore a simple navy blue blazer over a white blouse, and the metal pinned subtly near her heart glinted under the courthouse lights, barely visible unless you were looking. And many were. Jordan Maddox walked beside her, quiet but vigilant, his face tense with anticipation. He knew what today meant. What she was about to do wouldn't just determine the outcome of this trial. It would change how people saw her and how they saw themselves. Inside the courtroom, Officer Greg Thorne sat flanked by his attorney and two fellow officers. He no longer wore the smirk that had marked his earlier testimony. His eyes darted around the room, catching glimpses of unfamiliar faces, members of the public veterans who had come to support Camille, and reporters scribbling notes with urgency. Judge Marla Donahue entered the courtroom, her expression unreadable. A woman of few words, but strong convictions, she'd spent her career believing in law as a tool for justice. But today, like everyone else, she wasn't certain what version of justice she was about to witness. "Defense may proceed," the judge said. Jordan rose. "Your Honor, we request to call the defendant, Camille Brooks, back to the stand." The room stilled as Camille wheeled herself to the front. She placed her hands on the armrests, lifted her chin, and waited as the oath was read aloud. Then she took a breath, not just to speak, but to become something bigger than herself. "Ms. Brooks Jordan, began yesterday, you told the court your version of the events that took place the night you were arrested. But today, I want to ask you something different. Not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. In your own words, what do you think Officer Thorne saw when he looked at you?" Camille turned slightly, her eyes scanning the jury before resting on Thorne. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but unwavering. "I think he saw what he expected to see," she said. "A black woman alone, in a wheelchair. He saw vulnerability. He saw inconvenience. And somewhere in all of that, he decided I didn't belong where I was." The courtroom was silent. "But what he didn't see," she continued, "was the 20 years I gave to this country. He didn't see the mission photos, the early morning drills, the blood I've bled beside my comrades. He didn't see the strength it takes to come home and rebuild your life after combat, or the discipline it takes to live in a body that doesn't always do what it used to." Jordan stepped closer. "You mentioned your military service. Why haven't you spoken about it publicly?" Before Camille's gaze remained steady. "Because I didn't want to use it as a shield. I've never believed that a title or a uniform should be the only reason someone gets treated with dignity. My humanity should be enough. But I also know the reality. That sometimes to get heard, you have to remind people of your worth in their language." The gallery shifted, some nodding, others still stunned by the honesty in her words. Jordan's next question cut to the heart of it. "Camille, why did you decide to fight this? Not take a plea, not settle? Why are you here?" She didn't hesitate. "Because silence is its own kind of violence," she said. because I've been quiet before. I've let things slide. I've swallowed anger to protect my peace. But not this time. This time, I knew that if I didn't speak, he'd keep doing it to someone else. Someone without a lawyer. Someone without a record to prove their discipline. Someone younger, or older, or quieter. I couldn't live with that. Jordan turned toward the jury, his voice soft now. When Officer Thorne put his hands on you, what went through your mind? Camille's voice caught, but she held it together. Fear, yes, but more than that, clarity. I knew that moment wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who's ever been told to stay silent. Every black person who's ever been told their truth won't matter. Every disabled person who's ever been seen as less. And I knew. If I survived that moment, I'd spend the rest of my life speaking for those who didn't. There was no applause, no outburst, just silence, deep and reverent, as Camille finished her testimony. She returned to her seat, but something in the room had changed. A wall had cracked, and light was starting to seep through. Jordan nodded respectfully toward her before facing the judge. Your Honor, we have no further questions? Judge Donahue gave a short nod, but even she looked unsettled, her gavel resting in her hand rather than rising to declare order. There was nothing to silence. There was only reflection. As court adjourned for the day, the hallway filled with murmurs. Reporters whispered into microphones. Strangers held Camille's hand, tears in their eyes. Veterans saluted her quietly and respectfully. Jordan leaned close. You didn't just defend yourself, Camille. You stood for everyone who's ever been erased. She smiled softly. Good, because I'm done being invisible. Outside, the sky over Charleston began to darken, but Camille's stand had already lit a spark, and there would be no putting it out. The courtroom was tense like a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. Camille Brooks had spoken her truth, and the walls that once echoed with indifference now held their breath. Outside whispers turned into headlines. Inside, something deeper was unraveling the mythology of Officer Greg Thorne. Once hailed as a model cop, Thorne had built his reputation on charisma, selective enforcement, and a carefully crafted image. But the shield he wore so proudly now looked more like a mask, and cracks had begun to form. One by one, they split open. Jordan Maddox stood before the judge, his voice calm but purposeful. Your Honor, we request to submit new evidence documents pertaining to Officer Thorne's disciplinary history and prior complaints filed by civilians. The prosecutor objected. Those records are not relevant to this case, but Judge Donahue cut him off. Mr. Rayburn, if there is a pattern of conduct, the jury deserves to see it. Objection overruled. A soft gasp swept the courtroom. Camille sat motionless, her fingers curled loosely in her lap. She had already felt the weight of being silenced, judged, dismissed. Now she would watch the weight shift. Jordan approached the jury box, a file in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are about to reveal is not speculation. It is documented misconduct. He passed copies to the clerk. One by one, they were handed to the jurors. Pages that were once buried beneath bureaucracy now came into the light. Jordan began. In 2017, Officer Thorne was accused of using unnecessary force against a black teenager during a routine traffic stop. No charges were filed. In 2019, a Latinx man filed a formal complaint after being pulled from his car without cause. In 2020, a local woman alleged verbal abuse and intimidation. Again, no action taken. Each incident was closed internally. No public accountability. Thorne sat stone-faced, but his eyes flickered just enough for the jury to notice. This isn't about one mistake, Jordan said. It's about a pattern. And the thread that runs through it is race vulnerability and unchecked power. The prosecutor rose again, voice sharp with frustration. Your Honor, we're straying too far. But Judge Donahue raised a hand. Let him finish, Mr. Rayburn. Jordan nodded once in gratitude. Then he turned to face the man at the center of the storm. Officer Thorne, he began, you've described yourself as a protector of the community. But tell me, when you pinned Camille Brooks against your patrol car, when you ignored her rights and fabricated your report, who were you protecting? Then Thorne didn't answer. Was it procedure? Jordan continued, that told you to ignore a woman's disability, to escalate a peaceful encounter into an arrest? Or was it something else? A belief, maybe, that someone like her didn't deserve respect, that she wouldn't fight back. Thorne's jaw clenched. I did what I thought was necessary. You lied, Jordan replied coldly. And the only reason you're sitting here today is because the woman you targeted wasn't just a civilian. She was a Navy SEAL. She had a voice too strong to bury. The jury watched silently as the truth, long obscured by uniform and privilege, rose to the surface. And then Camille spoke. Not from the stand, but from her seat. Her voice cut clean through the silence. I didn't survive combat to come home and be assaulted by the people meant to protect me, she said. I've carried brothers out of burning Humvees. I've stared death in the face. But I never imagined I'd have to fight this hard just to be believed. Thorne's expression cracked. His carefully curated image, the commendations, the smiles for the camera, the thin blue-line rhetoric could no longer protect him. Because now, the courtroom had seen the real story, not of a hero in uniform, but of a man who mistook authority for righteousness, who weaponized his badge against the very citizens he swore to serve. And Camille, she wasn't the threat he claimed. She was the mirror he feared, a woman who had endured the unimaginable, then stood unflinching when the country she served failed her. When the jury looked at her now, they didn't see a defendant. They saw clarity. They saw courage. Judge Donahue glanced at the clock. We will recess until tomorrow morning, at which point we will hear closing arguments. As people began to rise, murmurs filled the air. No longer the hushed curiosity of the early days, but the stirring of something greater, something irreversible. Jordan leaned down beside Camille as the gallery emptied. He looked broken today, he said. He's not the only one, Camille answered. This system, this silence we've been trained to accept, it's cracking. Outside, the sun was low in the sky, painting the Charleston courthouse in long streaks of gold and gray. Camille paused at the top of the steps. Reporters waited. Supporters stood behind barricades. A little girl in a wheelchair clutched a sign that read, Camille is my hero. Camille smiled softly, but her eyes held steel. Tomorrow would bring a verdict. But tonight a false hero had fallen, and the world had finally seen who the real one was. The jury returned just after noon. The courtroom held its collective breath as the foreperson stood verdict slip, trembling slightly in her hand. Camille Brooks, upright in her wheelchair, watched without blinking. Her lawyer, Jordan Maddox, stood beside her, stoic ready. Greg Thorne sat across the room, shoulders slumped, the weight of the unraveling truth now etched permanently into his posture. In the matter of the state of South Carolina versus Camille Brooks, the foreperson began, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges. Gasps, then a swell of emotion surged through the gallery. Some cried, others clapped softly until the judge struck his gavel, calling for order. But the shift had already happened, not just in the verdict, but in the air, the atmosphere, the unspoken realization that something fundamental had changed. Camille exhaled slowly. She had waited months for this moment, not just for exoneration, but for justice to be seen, felt, and acknowledged. The judge cleared his throat. Furthermore, he continued reading from a separate document based on the revelations during this trial. The court will initiate a formal review of Officer Thorne's conduct, and we strongly recommend the district attorney pursue an independent investigation. Outside the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters. Microphones and cameras surged toward Camille as she emerged. But she didn't speak right away. She took her time. She paused under the sun, adjusted her blazer, and then looked directly into the lenses pointed at her. "I didn't come here today to prove I'm innocent," she said. "I came here to prove I exist. That people like me, black, disabled female, invisible to systems built to ignore us, are done being quiet." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Camille didn't smile. She nodded solemnly and rolled forward, flanked by Jordan and members of her community. There was pride in her eyes, yes, but more than that, there was purpose. In the weeks that followed, Officer Thorne was suspended without pay, then indicted. Investigations unearthed not just misconduct, but a culture of silence that had enabled it. Officers who had once stood beside him began stepping back, some even coming forward to speak out. His illusion of integrity collapsed quietly, publicly, fully. Camille didn't stop. She accepted speaking engagements not to relive trauma, but to redirect it. She began working with advocacy groups focused on intersectional justice, racial equity, disability rights, veteran dignity. She established a nonprofit called Shield of Truth, dedicated to educating officers on how to engage with disabled and minority communities with respect with humanity. She became a guest lecturer at military academies. She sat on justice reform panels. She stood where she had once been silenced. Her story began to appear in university classrooms, in officer training seminars, and HR diversity programs, not as a cautionary tale, but as a blueprint for courage. People asked her often how she'd stayed so composed, how she'd remained gracious in the face of betrayal. Her answer was always the same: "I've been through war, but nothing prepares you for being treated like you don't matter in your own country. You survive by remembering who you are, even when they try to rewrite you." Camille didn't seek revenge. What she sought was exposure to illuminate the rot beneath the badge, the lies beneath the reports, the silence that too often followed screams. She didn't see herself as a symbol. She was just a woman who had learned to carry pain and weaponize it into change. One evening, nearly a year after her acquittal, Camille returned to the Charleston courthouse, not for a trial, but to deliver the keynote at a community justice summit. As she stood before the crowd, a young black girl in a wheelchair rolled up to her afterward, wide-eyed and beaming. "Ms. Brooks," she whispered, "I want to be a SEAL too." Camille knelt beside her, lowering her eye level without hesitation. "You don't need anyone's permission to be extraordinary," she said. "Not even mine. Go be it." That night, Camille sat on her porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. Her medals were tucked in a drawer, her uniform folded neatly in a case. She didn't need them displayed anymore. Her battle had been fought not with rifles, but with truth. Her victory wasn't in winning a case, it was in forcing the world to see her clearly. The legacy she built would outlive headlines. It would ripple outward in stories, retold in policies, rewritten in girls, like the one she just met, choosing to believe they could be fierce and respected and visible. She was never just a defendant. She was a warrior, unbreakable in war, unshakable in justice, unforgettable in history. Camille Brooks's journey was never meant to be a spectacle, but it became a reckoning. What started as a routine stop under the gaze of a white police officer in Charleston unraveled into a nationwide conversation about truth, power, and visibility. A black woman, a wheelchair user, a veteran, a decorated Navy SEAL. She was everything the system refused to see and everything it feared when finally forced to look. Officer Greg Thorne's lie was simple and familiar. She was angry, violent, a threat. He never imagined the woman he tried to erase with paperwork and prejudice had built a career leading elite military missions operating in war zones most Americans would never step foot in. He thought her silence in that moment meant submission. He mistook her wheelchair for weakness. He saw her skin and assigned guilt. But what he couldn't see, what he didn't bother to see, was the strength of her truth. In court, Camille didn't just defend herself, she dismantled the story built to bury her. Her calm, precise recollection of events, her military record, the witness video, the contradictions in Thorne's testimony. Bit by bit, the illusion cracked, then collapsed. What remained was not just vindication, but a moment of transformation. For her, for the jury, for the community, for every black woman who has been silenced, for every disabled person whose voice has been dismissed. But Camille didn't stop with a verdict. She turned her pain into purpose. She launched Shield of Truth, an organization devoted to police reform and public education around racial and disability justice. She gave speeches, mentored young girls, sat across from policymakers, and demanded structural change. She never asked to be a symbol, but she became one, not of victimhood, but of unwavering resilience. Her story is not about heroism in the conventional sense. It's about reclaiming the narrative. It's about a woman who refused to let lies define her future. It's about reminding the world that justice is not something granted. It's something fought for again and again, with clarity, courage, and community. We live in a time when assumptions move faster than facts, and systems built to serve often fail the people who need them most. Camille teaches us that silence is not always peace, and that true strength lies in standing up even when you are seated in a wheelchair, facing a system that was never designed for you. She reminds us that dignity is not a privilege, it's a right. And truth, when spoken with conviction, can bring even the most fortified lies to their knees. For every viewer listening right now, ask yourself, how many Camilles have we walked past? How many voices have we ignored because we assumed they had no power? Her story calls on all of us to be better neighbors, leaders, listeners, allies. If this story moved you, inspired you, or even made you think differently, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us tell more powerful, truth-filled stories like Camille's. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next voice that needs to be heard. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that justice is possible. Together, we can keep building a platform where stories like Camille's don't go unheard, they change lives. Thank you for watching. And remember, truth doesn't just survive, it rises.